some people joining from very many different countries tonight to watch us have this slightly unusual conversation about you, actually. Um, First question, Selam, before we go into the actual nitty gritty of this topic, is that like there's probably a million things that you could be doing for your evening right now after a long day work. Why was it that you actually accepted to do this session?
I think first is this just the colors in the periodic table were so cool. And
The
then
colors, the
I
idea
was like, what
behind.
is this? What is this? Yeah. I was just very curious about it. Uh and yeah, exactly. And then the second thing is I just thought it was quite interesting the way you guys are approaching habits or micro habits or understanding people's personalities. So I was just honestly just very curious about how it works. It started with a conversation to see if our founders or the startups we work with would find this interesting. And then I raised my hand and decided to take one for the team instead. Because then I can also be better. Once I do it myself, then I can explain it to them afterwards. I just thought it's, yeah, curiosity, I guess, is the answer.
And of course, as a coach yourself, you have your own toolkits and things that you're working with. So this might also
Yeah.
maybe bring some things. And so, just before we go into the session itself, just a bit of a framing for today. Process framing, content framing. Process framing is
Mm.
that we're doing this, even though there's going to be people probably asking questions or sharing insights in the chat here. Really, the intention for today is to have you being on the stage as a coachee. So in other words, rather than you
Mm.
being the coach, for once it's you being coached. And the idea is to help you go through some of the questions that you asked, that I was asking you through the scan. So we have this scan, and
Mm.
then you have a dashboard that I'm going to show in a second, and then we can have a conversation around that and potentially come up with a micro habit that can help you in some way or another do your job. But if we look at the actual intentions behind this, just to be really clear, that I'm going from the assumption that you're in this constantly growth mindset. So
Yeah.
that you're on a never learning journey of personal development, which I think is pretty obvious looking at your profile. And we're doing
Yeah.
this to empower you. So if I'm at any point doing taking the conversation to a direction that is not actually serving you, then obviously I trust that you'll voice that, because it is for your benefit that we're doing this. We're doing this also with the idea of looking not just at blind spots in terms of communication behaviors, but also looking at things that you could label as superpowers, that are things that you already have nailed, that you do very comfortably. And it's a great idea to look at those as starting points for feeling good about oneself, but also building off those things. So that's the
Right.
sort of intention. And it's also very important to add that for psychological safety, if at any time you need me to sort of change the topic, or if there's questions I'm asking you that are not comfortable, regardless of the fact that we're on a stream, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for you to think out loud. So if there's one thing that you don't want to answer, just please voice it. I'll say thank you for voicing your boundaries, rather than saying I'll try and dig it further. And please
Okay.
interrupt me if you ever need, because I can have a time lag from this side, since we're quite far away geographically, so we get this time lag. So do
Mm.
interrupt at any time if we need to.
Okay. We'll do.
Uh, Talking to think is often something that in Finnish culture people don't like to do. They like to think before talking, and then they talk with a ready-made idea. For this
Mm.
particular format, I think it's really helpful if we just both talk to think. It gives a different type of dialogue than if we're constantly preparing our thinking beforehand. So, in other words, be welcome to talk to think. So, um, any questions about the process before I jump into giving a bit more framing of what the actual topic of the periodic table is?
Mm. No, I think it's all clear.
Cool.
Yeah.
So the chat today is going to be with people who might want to ask some questions. But those of you who've joined in the chat, I'm not going to necessarily be prompting you too much today. The idea is for Selam and I to have a conversation, and that you be privy to that. And it's a bit like if we're having a coffee in the lounge, and that you're just part of that same conversation. So if you do chat, I'll see the chat, but I'm really going to focus on Selam today. And the as mentioned by Salam a second ago, the periodic table is really the way we're working through this. So rather than talking in general, I'm using this theoretical framework of the periodic table to not just think about what you're doing with your communication, but also to sort of have concrete things that we can measure. So what perhaps would be worth doing is, before we go into any of the details, is that I could just show you what is this periodic table in a nutshell, so that you can have a bit of a mental model of why it's so complex, basically. If I now show this, we've got there we go. So in the background, if I zoom in, maybe you won't get as much bandwidth, but the periodic table is based on, as you already know, Selam, the behaviors. So a lot of people today talk about, in business and startups, personality models. They spend a lot of time working and thinking and measuring personality. But what we found in human-to-human interactions is that most useful is to actually just look at behaviors. What people do is way more important than who they think they are. So this is really just a periodic table of all the different behaviors that humans can do in any culture, in any language. And the bottom bit is what we call human to self. So it's basically the communication towards yourself in your head, so H to S. And they're like mental models. Like one of them that we might talk about today is functional conflicts. What is the difference between a functional and a dysfunctional conflict? And then if you then look at the top of the periodic table, that's really what we call human to human communication, which is the communication from you to another person or you to a group of people. So that's how it's working. The top is the colored, it's the verbals, non-verbals, and intentions. And then the bottom is mental models. So we're going to focus more on the bottom, which are the internal and the mental models. But I'll identify any element from the periodic later, because we have a whole YouTube channel where we go deep into each one of those 130 elements with different learning content. So some people like to go deep in one, but we're not going to go too much into sort of mentoring today or anything like that. I might just draw a few things with my notepad here. If we need to sort of doodle or something, I might just draw. But otherwise, the focus is really just on you and what your current situation is. So without further ado, maybe we could just go into the check-in and talk about what I think as a calibration. There's many different ways we can talk about communication. So we can talk about it on the mundo level, which could be like social media, something you've studied a lot and work a lot with daily. So you in the public domain. The macro level would be you with Antler. So in the startup ecosystems, working with startups, with investors, with founders. The meso level is your daily ops. So thinking of you and your team, your close collaboration. So the communication on a meso level would also be another level that we can talk about. And then the micro level is really, it's like you in your own head, talking to yourself, self-reflection. So out of those four different levels, is there a particular level that would serve you most for us to focus on today? Straight in with difficult questions.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess the micro and meso might be interesting somehow, because it's probably one that you could also affect. I don't know. I guess.
Micro and meso, yeah. So really more focused on, which is, by the way, very good idea to start from those, because that's the foundation of all the others. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we can focus on the micro and meso level with the idea that obviously they're impacting all the other levels, but also there is another thing I wanted to ask you before we jump into the actual thing is there anything right now that you're working on that you would really like to sort of focus the conversation on? It could be that, because you mentioned in the different situations of communication that there is conflicts sometimes that are challenging. You're doing a lot of events, recruiting, workshops, writing, working with leadership, and yourself being the leader in your teams and working with other people who are leaders. Out of all of these different topics, is there any particular that right now you'd like to focus on our conversation?
Yeah, I guess like leadership is definitely something that I've been reflecting a lot on and trying to understand what's the best way to communicate with others, especially when you're supposed to be in charge of managing the day-to-day interactions, whether it's a task that you're supposed to do and you so happen to be the person who's supposed to manage or like oversee the execution
Mhm.
of this. So it will be interesting to discuss leadership as a concept and also communication, like leadership communication, like not as a boss, but like what are the best scenarios or what are the best ways that you can make sure your message is been forwarded across, and then like how do you follow up and how do you make sure things get done without
Mhm.
coming off as arrogant and or as very demanding.
Is there just sort of like taking a step back? So you're currently based in Kenya, in Nairobi.
Mhm.
You're working. You have when you can get your visas and travel. You also go around quite a lot of different countries. Um,
Yeah,
what's your daily? What do you do in your daily job in a short sense, so that we can calibrate what we're talking about here?
yeah. So I mean, there's not 2 days that are this like that's the world of startup in general,
Hmm.
but I typically do uh, recruitment is one major area where I do interviews, a lot of interviews, like sometimes like 10, like 5 to 10 interviews a day on a typical day with potential candidates that are going to become founders or who are interested in becoming founders for
Hmm.
Antler. Um, then I will have a session or two coaching with current existing teams that are currently in the program and are building an idea out for them to receive an investment.
Hmm.
And then most of the emails or the email interactions would be partnership related. They're follow ups from previous conversations we're trying to set up a meeting or trying to send a follow up proposal or responding to some potential way that we can collaborate with. Because the 3 areas like scouting, recruitment, marketing, and partnership are my main kind of pillars or the main sector areas that I lead. So I would touch on these 3 things on the daily, on different
Hmm.
capacity and different intensity. But yeah,
Okay, so in those roles, obviously it's quite easy and tempting to go into the sort of cultural differences, age differences, gender differences that can appear. But if we step
yeah,
back from that a second and go, if you had a magic wand, like anything is possible, no limitations, open sky, blue sky thinking, what would you shift in your capacities to communicate? Because you're already an
I
expert.
think
I mean, if I look at your data, there's quite a lot of things
no,
that you've already nailed. So, what would you ideally
no.
want to sort of shift if you could shift anything?
I think just being even more effective in making people understand what's supposed to be delivered and like being like having that clarity and an alignment without having to do a lot of back and forth would
Mm,
be like such a lifesaver if people could just tell my magic one if I could listen to people and I realize are they lying to me or no. That would be great because I don't want to
I'll have that
find
one
out
too.
like after having done all the work and then what they say they want to do and what they do is different.
Yeah,
And I don't know if this is because people's priorities change or they genuinely did not know what they wanted at the time
yeah,
and they thought
yeah,
that's what they wanted. Because my job, like I said, requires a lot of trying to cater to people and trying to like make these people's lives easier so they can move at an exceptional speed to try and build these super interesting startup ideas so we can eventually invest in them. But
yeah,
it always starts with the assumption that the people who come to us genuinely want to do these things. And that's why we spend a lot of the time and the energy to make that happen.
yeah.
But ultimately, if the real motivation is not there, or like if the communication has not been truthful, or the priorities change somehow, or just something changed, then
Hmm.
you lose so much time and effort. And you realize like this, you're trying to support someone who is really not that serious or hasn't done the work to reflect on themselves or were not able to communicate what they wanted.
Hmm.
So that makes my life more complicated. So if I had my magic wand, I would make everybody else be self-reflective Buddha that is truthful and honest.
That'd be
It'd be a
nice.
great
That'd be nice.
world.
I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, it'd be
I think
great.
so. I think it's such a great world, honestly. But yeah,
But, but at least we can start with startups.
yes, exactly. It's not as bad. I'm just because you asked for it, the question. That's why I'm like, that would be what
Yeah,
would make it better. Yeah.
totally. So in a way, I'm asking you this to sort of calibrate also where we go in this conversation, because as you
Mm,
can see from the periodic table, it's so wide. We can talk about so many
yeah.
topics, but in in um, in a simplified way, how much do you remember the green, blue, red model that talks about influence back in the days of the Aalto
Yeah.
University? How much do
Yeah,
you
no,
remember
you
any
have to
of it?
remind me. You have to remind me
Okay.
because I know it, but I don't remember it. Or at least I remember you giving that class. At least
I thought I'd
I'm
draw
such a
this up
bad
with you
student.
because don't worry about it. It's just that the drawing of
Sorry.
it might actually unlock something to do with self honesty and
Okay.
looking at how people. Basically, it's also one of the ways that people detect lying, which could be quite
Uh,
useful in the
okay.
context that you just said. So if I just draw this up, I've got a whiteboard. Can you see my white paper here?
Mm-hmm.
So the simplify. I'm going to draw this quickly because there's lots of videos on YouTube that I made about this. But just so we have a mental model that we can work with, if there's person A, person B, and this person A could be you, so we could put S actually, and then you are talking to either a group of people or another person here. If we
Yeah.
simplify back to what's going on in those dynamics, you essentially can look at it from the point of view of there's a person who's talking or who's communicating, who's the anchor. So we could put this anchor in blue. So that's the reference point. That's you. So
Yeah.
you could be talking with a focus on yourself. So, for example, in the startup world, if you're a coach, that might be bringing your expertise. Focusing on yourself would be your knowledge. It could be your checklists, anything that belongs to you that the other doesn't know and that you're informing them of. So it's what most people think of communication. It's the informing part.
Yeah.
That's one aspect. Then another aspect is that you can communicate focused on the other, which is, by the way, giving you the color coding for the whole periodic table here.
Mm,
So
okay.
the other would be green, so it's the color of empathy,
Mm,
and it's the color of focusing on. Just like you could talk about your knowledge, you can when you're recruiting somebody, no doubt you're going to be spending quite a bit of time asking them open questions, asking them about what they do, what their motivations are, and so on. And that's what we would call talking focused on the other, talking green. So
mm,
that is basically the same. You could ask them about their knowledge, you could talk about the very same topics, but here the focus is on the other.
yeah.
And red is the focus on common, which is usually common action or common agreement to action, which could be something like if you're looking for recruits in Antler, you'd be looking at who are the ones that you're actually going to invest in or find and support and coach. So the red is the common action. And what happens is that often people don't pay attention to this dynamic. They're focused entirely on the blue and the red. So in
Mm,
schools, we're taught only to be blue and red. There's very few people who are trained to be green. Therapists are trained, comedians, stand-up comedians are trained. Some politicians do it more or less well, but most people have no idea what it means to be green. So they mix all the colors, and what that creates is a confusion and this illusion of dishonesty or manipulative
mm,
communication. So you look at
yeah.
that in social media, and it's very, very common to see that people are essentially talking mix of about themselves, about the other, and about the common action. And what's really interesting is if you do a pattern analysis of these three colors, you'll find that there is a universal pattern of percentage of proportion of time spent on each, and there is a universal pattern of order in which it works to influence. So if you let's say that you're trying to influence somebody in the startup ecosystem to be doing a particular type of action. Like let's imagine that you've got a CEO who's not doing completely all that was recommended, and you want to influence them to do that.
Mm,
That would be the red. To get to the red, there's a pathway through these colors, which is actually quite universal and not cultural. Now, that I'm not going to get you guessing on this because you probably already know it. But if you start looking at the pattern, it's up to 75% of green. And when you color code, for example, text, and you color code dialogues, color code pitches, color code people's conversations, you'll find that the ones who are the most influential and who don't go into manipulative or dominative behavior of influence, they're usually using a very, very high percentage of green. They're using 20 or so percent of blue and 5% or so of red in their communication. So that could go like green is you, Selam. If you were the startup, I could say you, Selam, you want to be a successful startup. You're looking to turn your company into a unicorn, and you've got this great idea. All that's green because I'm talking about what belongs to you. Then you'd go, so that you would usually start from the green. Then you would go to the blue, which is I have a particular expertise, opinion, and so on about this. And then that constant backwards and forwards of green and blue, generally, if things go well, lead you to the common action and agreement, which is usually the end of a meeting or the end of it's the call to action in social media. Now, what most people actually do in practice, and I'll show you your colors from your data afterwards, most people spend way too much time on the blue and way too much time on the red, and they do it too early, which creates opposition, distrust, and friction. So that's the basic recipe that has been throughout history. You can find it. I mean, if you look at Nelson Mandela's speeches, it's very clear. If you color code his speeches, you can see a lot of green. If you look at Obama's speeches, you can see the same thing. If you look at even Hitler's speeches, not saying that I agree with this politics, but you'll find that pattern of influence that's pretty much universal. Problem starts when you start placing that, and this is the link to what you said earlier in the check-in about lying, is that there is a color that is potentially different on the verbal level, so what you say with your words, the non-verbal level, which is how you say it with your body language and your eyes and your timing and your rhythm and so on, and why you say it with your intentions. And essentially, if you don't want to use a lie detector, which is probably quite unethical in startup ecosystems, your go-to way of understanding what's being honest or not is looking at, are they using the colors on the three levels consistently? So I'll give you an example. If somebody is talking green, that could be open questions. A red question is an action question, like in design thinking, a how might we question leading to a brainstorm. That's a red question, as an example. And then a blue question is an investigative question with a direction in it that belongs to you. Like, don't you think, yes, no, that it would be a great idea to do this type of investment portfolio? That's a blue question. So if you ask a question that's green, generally an open question, but the body language that goes with it is, for example, blue, meaning it's focused on yourself. Like blue body language would be blue, like, for example, blue timing. I'm asking when it suits me or in my own speed and rhythm. It's quite different than if I do that also in a green timing. Green timing would be focused on the other person's time. So if you send an email, is the email sent when it suits them, the receiver, or that's green timing? Or is it sent when it suits me because I've just finished writing it Friday evening? That's blue timing. So green non-verbals, green verbals, and then the green intention, which could be, green intention is, for example, respect, empathy, kindness, connection, whereas a blue intention might be ego, responsibilities, or getting my job done in a red way. So what then happens is that when somebody is not honest, and it's not out of bad intention, it's just that they're having a red intention with, for example, a blue timing and a green question. When you have those three things that are disaligned like that, that's basically how you can quickly detect somebody who's being what they call incongruent. So if you're looking at somebody in an interview, how do they say what they say and what are the intentions that they've expressed with what they say is as important as the actual words that they're saying. So what you can do is, for example, look at how are they aligning, basically, those, are they congruent between what they say, how they say it, and why they say it? And when they're not, that's generally a sign of either internal lack of self-knowledge, which is very common, or then there's just dishonesty. This makes sense, or shall I go back to the draw in a second? Does this?
Yeah, no, it does. It's quite interesting.
So if I look
Yeah.
at this now with your slides, with the actual data from you, I think what's interesting is now to look without taking the data too seriously, because it's really just patterns that can change from one situation to the next. The
Yeah.
situations of communication that you highlighted, the common ones here are, as we talked about, events, recruiting, and
Yeah.
workshops, writing, leadership, and conflicts is the one that's the most challenging. If we go
Mhm.
to the green, blue, red lens, which is the one where we have this,
Mm.
we have this is the influence lens. So you'll recognize the picture in the middle, which is about
Yeah.
looking at the green, blue, red.
Yeah.
What I'd like to show you, I'm actually going to zoom out quickly so I can show you the end of the slides, is the overall pattern that you have here. There we go. So this is your summary of, maybe I'll zoom in from this side so that you can see this a bit better. Here we go. This is really just you and your overall green, blue, red in the moment when you answered this scan. So you
Mhm.
have your own competence. So it's a score out of 10, 8 out of 10
Okay.
means that out of all the different verbal techniques in the periodic table, there's at least 8 of each color. So this is a summary score. 8, you're feeling 8 out of 10 competent to verbalize blue. In other words, talk about what belongs.
Mm. Right.
6 out of 3, 6.3 is 6.3 out of 10 feeling competent around getting people to action through your words, your verbal red, and
Right.
7.3 is your green. So
Mm.
what's interesting here is where you have the differences in the levels. So if you look at
Mm.
your verbal behaviors and intentions, where the thing is interesting is where they're not aligned, like here.
Yeah.
So what that tells us is that you're probably going to have moments when your intentions are green, like
Yeah.
8.3, you have a lot of green intentions. So focusing on the other in your mind, but in the behavior, in your verbals, they might not always come out to the other person. They might not understand that your intention was empathy or respect because
Yeah.
of the way it's either said or the words being said.
Yeah. Interesting.
So this is so this is the overall thing. So obviously, if you're and this is there's no right or wrong. This is not a good or
Yeah.
bad thing. There's no judgment of value. It's really just going like, okay, where are those aligned? So if you're focusing on getting influence,
Mm.
that's red. So what we can see is that the score that you feel the least comfortable with is the 6.3 red. So when you're talking to get action, to get influence, to get people to change a behavior, for example, that's where you're most likely going to feel less comfortable than being empathic or focusing on your responsibilities.
Yeah.
So before I go
Interesting.
into the next, this is just like an intro for you to sort of see where
Yeah.
that let's go. We drill down
Yeah.
in any of those buckets really in quite a lot of detail. But is there a particular situation that you're thinking of where you had a moment where you wanted to influence somebody and you didn't manage to sort of influence them in the way that was either effective or frictionless?
Mm. I think it's not a particular situation, but it's more having to have the exact same conversation about a task that needs to be delivered and it not being delivered over and over again. And you feeling not powerless, but like just not knowing how to say it to a point where I'm like, okay, let's just let it be, knowing that this is bothering me because if I was told to do something, I would have done it already. But then I'm not getting the same response from the person who's supposed to be doing this. And
Mm-hmm.
not just once, twice, but like several conversations. Um, yeah, that has happened a few times for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So in a way, the whole topic here that we're opening up, and I noticed in the chat there's a question from Nibiu. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Asking, is it the same with individualistic and collectivistic society? What we're working with here, what we're looking at here, are patterns of individual behaviors that are. You can literally look at them in the same way, whether they're collective, and you look at social media influence, or individual leaders in a particular one-on-one. They're absolutely the same things. And what I think is popping up in my mind as you speak, Selam, is that what we could look at now is the topic of conflicts. Because I have your blog post there about traveling in Africa, which was one of your big frustrations. I'm going to open up the lens of chaotic. Do you know the lens chaotic? Have you ever heard of that? The
No,
idea of chaotic balance.
no, no. I'm gonna take a note of
Chaotic balance
this.
is the one that when we work with startups, it's the number one lens that everybody asks for because it is usually the most lacking in
Really?
startups. So the idea of chaotic comes from Dee Hock, the founder of the Visa Corporation. So he's probably one of the most successful ethical business ventures in the last century, and he essentially copied nature to build businesses. And his key insight was that nature is chaotic. In other words, it naturally balances chaos and order. And that when you want to build a business that is successful and ethical, it's a good idea to try and mimic that idea. You know, biomimicry we talk a lot about in design, but you can also do biomimicry with communication and organization design and business. And essentially what you get to is the balance of chaos and order. So how it works is that if the reason I'm pulling this lens out is because that was one of the lenses that you had written down as where there might be moments where you're wasting time. The symptom of the chaotic lens is that when there's a waste of time. So if you think of a group of people, you have states. People can be in a different state of either. So this is a group of people. So hands up in the air. There you go. There are people here. They could be in different states. They could be in a state of chaos. So not much structure going on. They could be in a state of order. They can be in a state of control, a lot of rules, a lot of procedures, red tape, like in the embassies with Visa. And then karmos, which is the destructive chaos. So chaos is positive, karmos is negative. And when you go too far with the group either way, so if I'm looking at a group of people in a startup workshop, for example, you do a design thinking workshop, if you have too much control, too much rules, obviously the group just implodes on itself. People just get engaged and bored. And if you've got too much chaos, karmos, the group explodes instead of implodes. So most people understand intuitively that you need a balance of chaos and order for the group to function. What is very less known is that the path of balance. If I draw this path that goes across the middle here, which is called the chaotic balance. The chaotic balance is there's a recipe for keeping it that is not actually very difficult to keep. But if most people forget that there is two things going on, if I draw an iceberg, the classic metaphor of the hidden iceberg, the top of the iceberg is the content of a conversation. So we're talking about KPIs, we're talking about investment, we're doing pitch decks. That's content. The process is how we talk about it. And what science has shown us, and what Dee Hock has put really nicely in his books around chaotic organizations and teams, is that the kind of secret recipe to keep the chaotic balance over time is to lock down the process. So I'll draw a little lock here. So the more you lock the process, the more you can have a balance. And most people do exactly the opposite. If you think of Slush, for example, big conferences, most people structure the content. So they have keynote speakers with lists of topics already a few months before, if not years before. But the process is often down to chaos of networking. What actually we know today is exactly the opposite of what is needed for a good chaotic conversation and team to work. So the amount of time wasted is indicated by how much we've ordered the process. So, for example, process order would be rules of conversation. Like in our case, today, one of the rules, implicit rules, is that you can interrupt me, which is a
Mm,
tiny thing. But if I don't say
yeah.
it, you might hesitate because you're being polite, for example.
Yeah.
The other one is process. Like, what are the steps to get from beginning to end of the conversation? Is it just like one long chaotic ride, or do we start with a check-in, have a dialogue, then a brainstorm, then we do synthesis, and then we do a checkout? That's the process of conversation.
Mm,
Roles, and then timing, clear time, somebody looking after time. These are a few things that you'll find that we all know from, I mean, you studied design thinking, so you know about,
yeah.
for example, how to run a workshop. But often
Yeah.
what we don't pay attention to is that the content, it needs chaos, because the beautiful chaos of creative thinking is only possible to get if we have enough lockdown of structure and order with the rules, the roles, which is why it doesn't really matter whether you use a sprint, a design thinking workshop, lean methodologies. Any process that structures rules, process, roles, and time is valuable. But it's
Yeah.
down to how much we bring that process structure into place, the hidden part of the thing.
Mm,
So I'm
yeah.
drawing an intro for you so that we can look at your data.
Yeah. How much of this do you think is affected by the feeling of empowerment? Like, if you feel like it's not my place to create the order versus, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
does it have
yeah.
anything to do with external permission of sorts?
Absolutely. And that's also one of the things we measured in there is basically if nobody feels authorized, in other words, authority, if there is nobody
Yeah.
who feels they have the authority to host
Yeah.
a process or facilitate a process, then
Yeah.
what we can expect is chaos and
Mm,
therefore waste of time. The sign of too
right.
much chaos is too much waste of time. And I mean, when you have people going to a meeting, and this is not cultural, by the way, this works in any
Yeah.
culture. If you go into a meeting and people are all walking away feeling that they've wasted their time, that's a sign there's too
Yeah.
much chaos in the process. So it's
Yeah.
brilliant what you're saying, because if nobody has the authority and the legitimacy to deal with that, then what we can expect is more chaos. So that
Mm,
leads to another question: is who has the authority and who should have the authority?
yeah.
Because when you're in a startup, obviously people start to think, oh, it's the leader of the startup, it's the founder, it's the CEO. But when you're in a multidisciplinary team with people, like you're in an ecosystem where you have a startup and then you have an investor, and there's no
Yeah.
clear lines of authority actually.
Yeah.
And that's where
Exactly.
time, yeah, that's where time gets
Yeah.
wasted. So if I show you now your chaotic data, um, well, quite clearly there is what you indicated at the beginning was that yes, sometimes there is a waste of time.
Mm,
So if I show you now the scores that are, uh, there we go. Maybe I'll zoom in again so you can actually see this better. The
yeah.
the circle here is a measure of your potential wasted time from disruptive chaos. So that, according to what you said, is like quite a lot of time. And then in the middle, we're measuring the freedom to communicate, which is an indirect measure of chaos. So obviously,
Mm,
freedom is great, but too much freedom can also lead to chaos. So you've got a high degree, 8 out of 10, freedom to communicate. So
yeah.
those two things together show us that there might be a place or two where you want to think about authority and mitigating that chaos, if you like, to
Yeah.
get less waste of time, in a sense. And this is
Yeah.
where those are, those touch points. This is basically a quick measure of the touch points of where you
Hmm.
might benefit from bringing more structure. So the high
Mm,
scores is where you have a lot of order and structure, and the low scores, like this 6 one, which is if I bring in the zoom, this 6 here is I think harvesting, collecting
mm,
information, notes, and the second
mm,
lowest. They're not low; they're 7 out of 10, so they're pretty high. But if
mm,
there was a place to prioritize, bring in order,
yeah.
those are
Right.
the places that most likely would benefit you most.
Mm,
Learning and harvesting. Harvesting, in the sense, is gathering the collective intelligence for other people. So, like, if you're in a workshop, who's the one taking a picture of all the post-its, for example?
yeah. Or just finding the right advisors for some of the idea. I mean, yeah, you do. You do. It's part of the work, I guess. Like, you do need to spend a lot of time to try and support. But again, that's also the task that takes the most time. So
Yeah.
I can definitely see. I can definitely see how.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so in a chaotic sense, there's a few things that are interesting to measure. One is where are the touch points. So, you know,
Mm,
bring in more order in harvesting and hosting and facilitating generally yields a very good saving of time for the collective, which when you multiply by
mm,
the number of participants, and if they're consultants, you add their charge rates to it, there's a real
yeah.
cost equation to that time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Mm,
But
yeah.
this is the second thing that we're measuring is that whether you're an expert or in one field or another, you can actually break down your role with regards to the collective in very
Mm,
simple buckets that are universal. You can be those caps, those white caps. You can be a guest, so it means you just jump into a process as a guest. You can be a normal
mm,
participant. You can be an expert participant, you know, who usually likes to talk more. You
mm,
can be a harvester, which is the one looking at the collective intelligence, not just taking notes for themselves, but making sure that there is something valuable on the output of the conversations. The content is valuably brought out and shared forward. The host
yeah.
is like a facilitator, but they're focused more on the process. So I'm using the
Mm,
word host, not facilitator, because facilitators tend to confuse the two levels of content and process. They tend to manage both the content of the conversation
yeah.
and how we go through it. Whereas a
Yeah.
host, a movement called the art of hosting, that's
Yeah.
universal. Like you probably heard of them.
Yeah.
Um, art of hosting are basically focused only on the process. And then the last role is the steward, who is the one who's looking at long-term processes, so rules, templates, structures like that, project
Mm,
management. So where there's yellow here, it's indicating that those are the roles that you are comfortable and regularly taking. So you
mm,
often take the hat of an expert, the hat of a harvester, and the hat of a host.
mm.
Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yes.
so those are perfect because in a situation where you have too much chaos, you really need mostly those two, host and harvester. When somebody
Mm,
is in a startup, for example, and nobody's hosting and harvesting, it just amplifies the chaos.
mm,
So this is really good news. It means that you're already doing those hosting and harvesting things. Where things usually go to waste time is when there's too many experts and not enough hosts. So then you
mm.
end up having long discussions and people talking over each other, wasting time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is universal, so it doesn't require you to be in one industry or another. This works whether you're in a fintech startup or running an ecosystem. There's always going to be those collectively intelligent roles, what we call chaotic roles. So
Mm,
this is worth paying attention to. Is that when you have an event or a meeting or a webinar or something where there's people that potentially can waste time, um, it's really like a good idea to sort of prepare particularly the host and harvesting of what's going on so that you can mitigate
mm.
that chaos beforehand. But then it goes
Right.
to three or four different levels of depth because you might follow Otto Scharmer from MIT. Have you heard of Otto Scharmer's work? MIT's work.
No.
This is actually very useful for startup founders as well.
Yeah.
Um, MIT's been working on leadership development,
Yeah.
and this is the model from Otto Scharmer's simplified levels of conversation. So he's got this book
Okay.
called Theory U, which is really worth having on your bookshelf. It's essentially his postulate is that leadership today is broken because most people are working without enough collective intelligence. They're working with
Mm,
individual ego intelligence. And the symptom of
mm,
that is we're doing too much level one. So there's four levels of conversation, and that's what I've
mhm,
measured with you. Level one is small talk. So it's like just chit chat. You're in a big event. You talk about the weather. Past
yeah.
oriented. Level two is discussion. That's what academia is all about. This is what political debates are all about. TV debates, right and wrong. When you go
Mm,
past the judgment barrier and you go beyond the discussion, you get to a level called dialogue, and then that opens up completely different intelligences. And then the deepest level of collective intelligence is co-creative presencing level. So it's where you're not judging the other, you're holding space for the other, you're allowing anything that pops up in the conversation to grow. It's a bit like in a creative conversation where you do co-creation, you're not judging ideas as good or bad until you've got them out. And
Yeah.
so exactly the same as when you do design thinking workshops. In everyday conversations, people can operate at these different levels. And what MIT's been finding is that leaders who operate on levels 3 and 4, those, deeper levels, generally do much better in business.
Mm.
We're only trained generally to talk on level 1 and 2, which is discussion and small talk. So
Yeah.
you're less comfortable, according to this, 6 out of 10 on discussion, which is not a bad thing, because that's not a level that's as useful as those level where you're feeling more competent. So that's, in a way, that's one of your superpowers, is that you're probably quite comfortable navigating a co-creative conversation, a dialogue and things like that, more than having this sort of hardcore discussion with debate.
Yeah, I hate debates, actually.
Why is that?
I don't know. Why are we fighting? Like, it's not that serious. Nothing is
Yeah.
that serious. I think to be able to debate, you have to really have very strong conviction about what you're saying, and you also have to have very strong judgment about others. And I just don't have that. I don't understand why that's necessary. Like, honestly, I'm like, yeah, we can agree to have our different opinions, and I do have colleagues that are absolute debaters, which this pisses them off because like I'm the energy, It's like, why are you not arguing with me? I'm like, I just don't care that much. No, not caring. It's like I agree. Like I accept your opinion as is. It doesn't need to change, so I can believe it, or you don't have to believe in what I'm saying. And for some people, it's hard. For me, it's I just don't like to argue.
And in a way now,
Might not be a good thing. Yeah.
if basically now you have an extra reason to sort of go deeper, because clearly, if you look at the leadership problems that we have today, if political governance, corporate governance were all able and skilled to have dialogue and co-creation, not just discussions, it would literally shift a lot of, because you can't solve complex problems with discussion. We need to be able to tap into the sum of all the thinking in a dialogue or co-creation to solve some of the complex systemic problems of the world. So it's kind of, it's intuitively, you're already doing what is the most effective way of getting things solved by going beyond the judgment of right or wrong. Anytime that somebody goes right or wrong, they're essentially just short-circuiting their collective thinking. They're just stopping themselves from going deep into the real problems. There's a time for discussion, which is when you have to make a hardcore decision with a budget. But that's a different thing. That's not the solving of the problem. That's making a decision.
Yeah, for sure.
So if I now zoom out from this is the chaotic lens. What's I think interesting here for you to take away perhaps is that you already understand in your practice what chaotic balance means, even if you don't use the word chaotic. And you already have the capacity to host and harvest. So now it's more of a question of being systematically thinking, that might be something I'm just going to jot down for the micro habit. That might be a micro habit beginning of, a trigger would be that when there's too much chaos that's coming up, maybe taking over the conversation and hosting it with a process. That could be one direction for the micro habit. The other is that where you're wasting time sometimes could also be just because the other person's needs to be heard are not fulfilled, which is linked to the whole topics of conflict.
So no, that could be, which is interesting.
Go on.
Sorry, can you zoom me out again just to see? I feel like the whole thing is slacking again.
The bandwidth is better when I'm like this.
Yeah, same. Okay, now it's back. I was just losing you. Sorry. I was just agreeing and saying that it's that could be a reason. I still think the authority part or the freedom to communicate and the not having hierarchy or any kind of authority to clear authority is like who's supposed to do what in general in the startup space, I think makes it hard for, you know, that one person
Mm.
to kind of influence others or vice versa. So you have to figure out the different ways. So I'm just reflecting on what we just
Yeah,
talked
yeah.
about, these
This
authority
is
figures.
exactly what we're here for, and I think this is related to the topic of ego distance. Now, this is a tricky topic because in the world today, people associate the word of ego with something negative. But if we
Mm,
just redefine ego as being a neutral, like money, it's neutral. It depends how we use it.
yeah.
And if we say that ego is about how we compare each other. So,
Mm,
for example, I create ego by saying I'm better than or worse than. So often people think that ego is when you're feeling better and that leads to a certain form of arrogance. But actually, ego is equally problematic when we are comparing ourselves negatively. I'm not good enough. Like a lot of Finns do this is like, oh, I'm very humble. I'm not good. I'm
mm,
not as good as you. That's also
mm,
ego because what it does
yeah.
is that it focuses the conversation on how I'm
Yeah.
comparing myself to others.
Yeah.
So if we take that particular definition of ego, what was really interesting is that your ego distance, your ego score for measuring how much you you take yourself seriously, if you like, is really low, which means that you're quite a Jedi of ego. In other words, you could be a very good conflict mediator if you needed to, because if I show you the score here, this is your ego score out of 10. 3 out of 10 shows that that's how much you compare yourself to others. So somebody who's got
Mm,
8, for example, is likely to be constantly comparing themselves. They're probably on Instagram looking at
mm,
other people all the time and going like, I'm better, worse than. When you have a
mm,
low score like 3, it means that you can quite easily detach yourself from your identity, whether it's the physical, emotional, social, spiritual identity, doesn't matter. But it means that you can more easily detach, take a step back, and
mm,
that is a prerequisite for you to be able to have um, facilitation.
mm,
If you're hosting, if you have basically authority, the more you have authority, the more important it is that you can have a low ego score so that you can do a good job of leading the conversation without getting triggered by other people. And
mm,
what we tend to see in business is that startup founders are often very ego comparative, which means that
mm,
anytime an investor or somebody disagrees with them, rather than trying to hear the other person, they start disagreeing and defending. And that creates conflict unnecessarily because rather than listening, they are focused on defending.
yeah. Do you think there's a thing, such a thing called like healthy competition or healthy ego in general? I mean, and I'm asking this because I'm just also, as you're speaking or describing this, remembering how like I'm I need to take sides, for example, or that has been feedback that is from either a colleague or another collaborator.
Mm-hmm.
When there are two very polarized conversations or agendas, I usually just remove myself out of it instead of taking a side
Mm.
or try. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
my head, I mean, that's my immediate. That's it's always been like that, and we can definitely dive into this and see what the hard wiring was and how did this happen. It could also just be a personality thing, but like I've been told at least maybe once or twice from senior like manager that I can't always avoid conflict or I can't always be a peacemaker. I need to
Mm-hmm.
take sides if I want to grow in my career. And this has been a feedback. For me, it came strange because that's not how my reaction would be. Why do I need to take
Mm-hmm.
sides? And or again, going back to nothing is that serious. Why can't we just find a middle ground
Mm.
versus having to like choose a side and like fight for?
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of this actually impacts not just me, but in general, like for people with this kind of characters. Like, is this is this a good thing? So we should just celebrate it and move on. Versus like, by being like this, are we actually missing out on actually achieving something more and better by trying to healthy competition? You know?
This is a beautiful topic. I'm glad. I promised that I wasn't going to do too much drawing and mentoring, but actually, this calls for another diagram, Salam, because you're literally putting your finger on one of the most systemic problems of the world right now around conflicts. There's a huge
Mm,
misunderstanding between a good and a bad conflict. So, when
mm,
people say this to you, it's because it's a symptom that they don't understand the difference between a good and a bad conflict. Taking
mm,
sides in a conflict is the quickest way to create problems,
mm,
and you know this from your intuition. That's why you don't do it. So I've actually measured conflicts in this, and I'm going to show you in a second. But like at the moment, we're being called, like, the biggest problem that we're being called to in all companies, whether they're in Africa or in Europe or in the US, is conflict transformation. And I'm deliberately using the word transformation, not mediation, because most
mm,
people don't realize that in a conflict is an opportunity for creative thinking. But
mm.
people think of a conflict, particularly if they're in conflict avoidant cultures like Finns, they tend to see of a
Yeah,
conflict as something to be avoided at all costs, or then you have to jump in and take sides and battle with the other person. That
yeah,
creates two problems. One is that it creates dysfunctional conflicts which destroy trust,
yeah,
create ego, like people start to take ego positions of right and wrong, defending one
yeah.
another, and it creates drama. And that drama
Mm,
is toxic because it doesn't help the collective intelligence, it just creates positions. So
mm,
if you look at the theory of conflict right now, what basically is going on is that when you hear somebody blaming somebody else, like if there's
yeah,
the blame that happens, or there's a strong position, you can essentially take four postures on that blame being voiced. One is that
mm,
so you have one is that you blame back, which is not what you do. But some people do that by default.
yeah,
Somebody says, like, you were late with your report, Salam. You were supposed to deliver it to me last week and you didn't, and it's your fault that we messed up this thing, and they blame you. So one
mm,
thing you can do then is blame back and say, no, it's your fault for not having briefed me earlier. The
yeah,
second posture is to blame self. That's what a lot of northern cultures do who are conflict avoidant. They say to go, oh,
yeah,
I'm bad, I'm not good enough. The third posture is hear my needs. So you might say in your head, "Oh, I needed more time. I needed a better, clear brief."
yeah,
And the fourth posture is to hear the other person's needs. When they say that you were late, they have a need that is implied and not expressed. And to hear their needs when they blame you is the sort of that's the only posture that a diplomat or a conflict mediator can take successfully. When the focus
mm,
is not on the other person's needs, when it's on my needs, my blame of self or blame of my of the other, it creates what we call a dysfunctional conflict, which is generally focused on ego,
yeah,
focused on personality, focused on right and wrong, and focused on it creates distrust. So when that happens, that's what most people think of as a conflict. That's toxic. That's really not helpful. But there is the positive conflict here, which is essentially what we call a functional conflicts, where you build trust and you get creative thinking. And instead of focusing on people and ego, you focus on needs, roles, processes, back to the chaotic. That's why the
yeah,
chaotic works, is because we're focusing on a task, a process. That's why we use ego hats, ego roles with a hat. Like if you're a facilitator, it's not you, it's not you, Salam, it's your hat. Therefore, you have a
mm,
distance, and therefore that
yeah,
distance creates a safe space for you to not take things personally and be able to create a functional, trust-building conversation, even if there's friction in the air.
yeah,
That's the thing that very few people are taught. Imagine if we were taught this in schools. That'd be like you could have people who could agree to disagree without taking themselves seriously.
yeah, yeah.
So
But if everyone is thinking like that, then is there a possibility that you might actually be the one losing out on,
well,
you know? I mean,
there's
you have
there's
your
an
peace
assumption.
of mind, which is great. I'm not advocating for
Oh, but
creating
it's not
more
necessarily
drama.
peaceful. It's not necessarily
Yeah.
peaceful. I mean, like I'm just showing you
Yeah.
here, like your own data. So if this is the left side here is the dysfunctional conflicts, and this is the functional
Mm.
conflicts. So the good ones, the bad
Okay.
ones. So you
Right.
naturally go to hearing other people's needs, which
Yeah.
is which is the posture that a conflict mediator should take, or diplomat.
Yeah.
This is the levels of tension in a conversation.
Mm.
So green is peace, one is tension, debate is two, breaking rules is three, and it goes down until you go to total destruction of each other. So
Right.
there's stages in that conflict. Obviously, it doesn't go straight to the red, but
Yeah.
if you are able to understand that even if you speak of other people's needs, it doesn't imply that you have to fulfill them.
Right.
It doesn't imply that you have to listen and obey. Listening is listening, it's not obeying. So you can listen
Yeah.
to another person's needs and not fulfill them.
Yeah.
That's often a confusion that people make, is that if I hear your needs and re-express them, you need this, doesn't mean that I agree, b fulfill.
Yeah. That's
So
true.
in a group dynamic, let's imagine that you're hosting a group and there's two people arguing.
Yeah.
The functional way of getting out of it is not taking sides. It is starting to re-express each side's needs that they're not expressing.
Yeah.
So you, Jonathan, over there, you have a point about this, and perhaps the need that you haven't formally expressed is this, that, and the other. So you summarize their needs. And on the other hand, there, Mira over there is having these needs, and how might we fulfill both needs?
Yeah.
Suddenly opens up the possibility for creative problem solving that is not either against one of them.
Yeah.
And that's essentially how you mediate conflicts. Most people don't believe it's possible because they've not been in a conflict mediation of that type. So they think that it's always going to be my needs versus yours competing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
generally speaking, if you're thinking like that, you can find a win-win.
Yeah. That's a good
So
point.
in an authority situation, the best way to keep authority in a group that becomes frictional, conflictual, is generally to sort of use green communication, which is focused on the other, and to
Yeah.
focus that green entirely on their unexpressed and unfulfilled needs, where they're usually talking about their feelings and their opinions. They're saying, I
Mm.
think, I don't like.
Mm.
So your job there as a host is to say, okay, you said this. Could this be the symptom of this need?
Mm.
Have you heard of nonviolent communication?
Yes.
Yes. So basically,
Yeah.
that's NVC. Nonviolent communication is pretty much about, this is the summary of NVC. You start with observation of facts that are on both sides aligned, and then you use the feelings that are usually negative as a symptom and flag to go to the unfulfilled needs, and only
Yeah.
then can you unlock resolution and negotiation of requests. Most people jump straight to requests without having gone through
Mm.
the stage of needs, understanding each other's needs. And that's essentially
Yeah.
what NVC advocates, is looking at use the feelings as flags for needs that haven't been identified.
Yeah.
So when you're coaching, for example, let's imagine that you're coaching a startup CEO who's a male older than you and who's a little bit conflict prone, who's a little bit challenging you in everything you say. If you go into that head front, you're wrong, you're just going to make it worse, as you know.
Yeah.
But if you say
Yes.
to them, okay, Green, you are at the moment feeling like this, and it seems that you're upset about that and resisting that, and you have a good reason to do so because there's a need
Mm.
behind it. Suddenly
Yeah.
that person feels heard. They might
Yeah.
even open up about their needs, and then suddenly you can open up that packet of potential and
Yeah.
unlock things that they haven't even seen themselves.
Mm. Yeah. It takes such a high emotional intelligence and patience, but yes, that's what you need to do, because the reaction sometimes would be either avoid, at least for
Mm.
me, it's like, okay, I know how this person is, so let's just avoid it, versus doing all of this. Like, I mean, not always, but typically it would be
Mm.
draining, and feels draining that you're the one listening and you're the one trying to empathize, you're the one trying to understand. So when you have to do this a lot of times, then it gets a little too intense. So then you start shutting down or like avoiding it. But exactly that's how it would be the best way.
Which takes us to the topic of boundaries and respect of self, because the respect is a two-way road. It's not just respecting the other person. As you said, listening and being empathic are very tiring. So because you're giving them attention, and so it's
Yeah.
tiring. So there's a point where even if you're the super host, super facilitator, and you're the hero, you
Mm,
have to respect your own needs as well. In fact,
mm,
if you look at the art of hosting movement, the ones who are basically trained
mm,
to be hosts, the first
yeah.
pillar is host yourself. In other words, host your needs, identify them, and voice those boundaries when. So if there's a boundary that's been crossed and your needs are not respected, then it
Mm,
becomes possible to be empathic with that other person who's voicing their needs.
yeah.
So maybe upstream from doing that is looking at where are you not respecting your boundaries enough? Where are your own needs sort of not necessarily respected by others?
Mm. Yeah, and how would you communicate that? Because you have a feeling of when that is happening, you know intuitively, you know
Mm,
emotionally, you know how you're reacting. Uh, but how do you verbalize this, and how do you verbally create boundaries instead of
mm.
shutting down and avoiding?
Well, in a way, you've got like everybody else, we all have our ego triggers, right? So it's an
Yeah,
ego trigger is a topic that gets you a little bit like, you know, defensive.
yeah,
So
yeah.
your ego triggers are roughly measured here. I had them in around the ego score measures. So first
Mm,
thing is to identify when you're actually being triggered versus where it's not. So it's quite likely that you might be triggered by some of these on your chart, which I'll send you in the email because it's too small for you
yeah,
to read here. But
yeah.
I take you an example: is behavior is one of your triggers potentially. So it means that when somebody's behaving badly or what
Mm,
you construe and judge as bad behavior, that's
yeah,
likely to get you riled up. So in those
right,
moments when you're being ego triggered, you're no longer in a position to actually host
right.
because your emotional temperature goes up and then you're basically part of the problem and you partake in this drama triangle of a victim, a savior, and
Mm,
aggressor, which
yeah,
I don't know if you remember the UNICEF project years ago, but there was this idea that if you go and you want to try and be the savior, the hero, helping people who are in a situation that you construe as victim, you're actually just creating the same problem by creating the triangle of, they call it the Karpman drama triangle. So you have the victim, the savior, and the aggressor, and you always need the three. They always work together. So if you're triggered, you become one of those roles. You become either the victim of being triggered, or you become the aggressor or the savior, the hero.
mm,
And when you're in one of those three roles, the drama takes over,
yeah,
and you're no longer being sort of objective, pragmatic, and host oriented. So that's the first thing: is that if you notice that you're being
yeah,
triggered,
for sure.
then boundary is basically saying, okay, right now I'm feeling triggered. It's not your fault. I'm not making you responsible, but I'm noticing that right now I just need a break. So it can be like postponing the conversation. It can be taking a coffee break if it's a workshop.
Mm,
It can also just be taking a breather and allowing somebody else to host. It doesn't, but it means that first acknowledging that you're a human being like everybody else and we all have our triggers. Everybody has
yeah,
triggers. But what's interesting is measuring how they're different because in different leadership teams, for example, often people have very different triggers, but they think that their triggers are like everybody else's. So one
yeah,
gets triggered
that's
by
true.
behavior, the other one gets triggered by money and status, and then they're all
Yeah,
getting into a fight for the wrong reasons. So if once you
yeah,
identify your triggers and you know what they are, and that you can sort of step back and not take them too seriously, which you already know how to do because your score of 3 out of 10 shows that you can detach. Once that is done, then formulating that as a boundary could go like this. Um, Somebody who's opposed always has a good reason and a need. So starting
mm,
from that, like when I do conflict mediation, I always start from this sentence, which is you obviously have a good reason to say, do, think, act, believe, whatever you do. I don't
yeah,
understand that reason. Could you help me understand your need?
mm,
Most people will be absolutely surprised because they're expecting you to
yeah,
take a position of right or wrong.
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
And
that's
then they
very
go,
clever.
oh, I don't know why. I don't know. And most people are quite unaware. So they don't know what's the feeling, or if they know the feeling, they don't know what the need behind it is. So that's why, like at the moment, I do a lot of conflict boot camps with transforming conflicts, where we train people to identify
Mm,
their needs, because most people just have no idea what their real needs are. So they turn up into a conversation being conflict prone. because of that. So if you understand that, it's a universal human thing that everybody, when they have their needs unfulfilled, they will create conflicts. So
Mm.
if you're knowing that, then basically you can start
Cool.
looking at the needs before you start
Yeah.
getting into conflicts. A good example of that is feedback culture. People think of feedback as a positive because it's like, oh yeah, we're modern culture. We give and receive feedback from each other.
Yeah.
I've been in companies where they put stickers on the wall of "We love feedback," and the whole
Mm.
culture spiraled downwards after a few months because they had no
Mm.
rules of consent for giving and receiving feedback. So what people were essentially doing is that they were coming and giving feedback in their own time about things that they
Uh,
thought were important, and people were having no psychological safety to receive that feedback, and it was
yeah.
creating chaos. So a
Uh,
very easy place to focus your conflict transformation is how the feedback is given and received. Are you
yeah.
giving are we asking basically consent for giving feedback? Most people don't even think about consent and feedback. They think feedback is a gift, therefore I'm going to give it to you when I want. And actually, that
Mm.
is hugely unsafe practice because most people are not ready to receive it when you give it. They're just like, oh, okay, thank you. And then they walk away and they cry in the toilets. So
Yeah.
it's a hugely easy touch point. Actually, I can show you your feedback metrics here in the flow lens. We do a very gross measure of feedback based on the three colors because most often people confuse advice, opinions, and praise,
Mm.
which are very different types of feedback. So if you look at yours here, so you give and receive green and red feedback. So this is the quantity of feedback. So you according to this data, you do get a lot of quantity.
Mm-hmm.
You get a lot of feedback, 10 out of 10. And this is the quality of feedback, which is if you color code it green, blue, red. Blue is your opinion or blue opinions. So it's something that is basically only valuable if you're an expert. I don't want a graphic
Mm.
designer's opinion on my legal contracts. That's value. It doesn't
Right.
have any value. But if I have a logo, my
Yeah.
graphic designer is very valuable opinion. So blue feedback is only useful when it's a qualified expert.
Yeah.
Red feedback is advice. And again, it's good to have from somebody who's qualified. Green feedback is what everybody needs, but nobody dares to ask, which is really feedback loop of where am I? Am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? Feedback loops. Like in a car, it's the speedometer. It's not giving you a judgment. Is it good to go at
Mm.
73 meters an hour? It's just saying, Selam, it's 73 and you're in an 80 zone. Be careful. That's all it's doing. And it's the same with humans. If we don't
Mm.
get enough green feedback,
Yeah.
we don't know where we are in the relationship to the other. So what
Yeah.
that's telling us is that you, at the moment, in that moment when you measured, you're giving and receiving advice, you're giving and receiving green, reassuring, praise type of feedback, but there's not as much opinion giving and receiving, which is probably not completely accurate because there's moments when you must be giving and receiving opinions. But this is a very
Yeah.
healthy type of distribution because most people have too much blue and red, whereas you have green already.
Mm.
So, in terms of conflicts, the only thing
Right.
here would be to make sure that when that feedback is coming, whether it's given or received, that there is consent, boundaries. So, for example, somebody
Yeah.
comes to you from a startup and says,
Yeah.
Selam, you know the accelerator program that we had 2 years ago? Can I give you some feedback? And that you're having one of those really shit days where everything's going wrong and you're super tired. That's where your boundary needs to be set. And you can say something like,
Mm.
oh, thank you. I really value the feedback, but right now I'm not in a position to receive it completely. So could we talk about that tomorrow morning when I've had a bit of sleep? And suddenly what you've done is respected your boundaries, respected
Yeah.
their need to give feedback, and at the same time create a space for that to happen in a psychologically safe way later.
Mm.
So boundaries can be something else than just the hardcore conflicts. It can also just be on your daily conversations around giving and receiving feedback from team members. That's also a boundary topic.
Yeah.
So we've gone
Yeah.
we've gone along we've gone onto different lenses. We've talked about if I zoom out from all this, because I don't want to overload your brain on an evening after a long day work. So I'm going to zoom out and do a bit of a summary here so that you can think and distill what we've talked about
Yeah.
on a meta level. We talked
Okay.
about ego lens, which is where we talked about the victim, savior, aggressor triangle and the ego triggers and the role and responsibility of being, doing your job, basically. Focus on
Yeah.
me. We've talked about the
Hmm.
influence lens and how the green, blue, red influence is related to having enough green at the beginning so that the other person feels heard, and saving
Hmm.
time with the chaotic lens, where structuring when there's a need for less chaos with roles and responsibilities around process.
Yeah.
We've talked about flow lens with regards to feedback, given and received feedback. We haven't looked at the flow lens itself in detail, but you can check
Yeah.
that data later and we can talk about it later. And then we've looked at alignment, where the three levels, verbal, non-verbal intentions,
Mm.
are they're aligned, you get somebody who's congruent and trustworthy. And if they're not aligned, there's an alarm bell that goes off. That person might be hiding something, or they might be dishonest, either with themselves or with me. And then the last lens of
Mm.
needs, where we talked about conflicts, where blaming self versus blaming others. How does that need get expressed? How does it get fulfilled? How do we tackle those needs so that the conflict becomes a positive one? So if we look at all of this that we've covered so far,
Yeah.
what are the insights so far that you've got from this that we can sort of tease out?
Uh, there were a lot. I think there were a lot. Just first, like knowing how to approach conflicts, and then also just being aware that it's not always, yeah, like stuff that I struggle with, or at least have brought it up when I was feeling this, where you have to take sides or you have to be competing all the time, and that's the only way you can succeed slash find your own path. I think
Mm-hmm.
it was good to hear and also see the ways to manage that. Um, the boundaries part was quite interesting. Also, just there's no shame in like creating your own boundaries, and then knowing how to verbalize that and being able to say this is where I draw
Mm.
the line without necessarily avoiding people. And then I think the first one with the influence without authority, I guess, so trying to communicate what you want to be delivered, the intention, the behavior, and the verbal behavior, all the intentional communication, where it was quite interesting to see the difference between the intention and the behavior,
Mm-hmm.
and how there's a bit of discrepancy there, um, which now, like in retrospect, I can see then how and why that could happen, and maybe because it was not communicated verbally, and the behavior is also not reflecting that, then of course the action is not coming, although
Mm.
I think it is, or I assumed I have made the communication by showing. For example, I think that's what I picked up, like the behavior is eights or something, the red part, and then
Mm-hmm.
the the verbal and the intention is like six or something like that, or the other way around. But anyway, I think
Yeah,
that's quite
yeah, yeah.
interesting because that really shows a lot about why why things might not happen, although I assumed I had made it clear. That's quite interesting.
In many situations, I don't talk about conscious communication. I call it intentional communication, because the unlocking is when people start their
Mm,
communication from the intention, which is often implied but not spoken. So I could say, for example, let's imagine interruptions. It's one of my favorite
yeah.
examples because I struggled with that in Finland. I come from a French culture where interruption is usually a sign of enthusiasm. So the implied meaning of an interruption in Finland is very different. I didn't know this. So when I interrupted people in Finland, I thought I
Yeah.
was being enthusiastic and they thought I was being rude. Now, if I had just intentionally expressed why
Mm,
I was doing this when I noticed the friction, out of respect for you, I'm just I'm interrupting because I'm so passionate about what you're saying. Suddenly, that whole thing is a non-issue just by voicing the intention. But because
Yeah.
we think it's obvious, my intention is it's not, because it doesn't. We're not telepaths yet, so we don't yet know
Yeah.
what the intention is. And
Yeah.
what happens is that when people don't know the intention, they fill in the gap and they start giving other people intentions. That's what you see in social media. When you
Assuming.
don't know, they assume that the other person's intention is generally
Yeah.
negative. So that creates a huge amount
Yeah.
of unnecessary conflict. So if you know that, then the simple trick is to always, if in doubt, if a tricky conversation occurs, if it's frictional, is to just systematically start from the intention. Like, out of respect, can I ask you a question? Out of empathy, whatever, whatever the intention is, voicing it is usually going to fix most
Yeah.
problems of misunderstandings just by that word being voiced,
Mm.
which is
Yeah.
why we have that
For
in the
sure.
periodic table at
No,
the bottom.
absolutely.
Yeah. So in
Yeah.
a way now we have two options.
Amazing.
One is that I can just let you go and have your dinner and rest, and we sit with those insights and have another conversation another day about all this if you want. Or we can now co-create a micro habit based on all of this that you could use to test a particular tiny tweak in behavior in a particular situation of communication that's coming out from all this conversation. Which would you prefer? Which would serve you better right now?
Wait, your connection is breaking. So the option was to do this now or to do this some other time.
Two options
You
is
were asking.
basically
I heard about the dinner.
two options is that do you now we've got a lot of insights. We've been doing some reflection on multiple different levels
Yeah.
of communication. We can
Yeah.
either use that to build a micro habit, which would basically be something that can be a
Yeah.
prototype that you can use in your daily communication, or that already what we've done might be enough for you to go and do some food for thought later, and that's already enough for you to take on your plate. So I'm just being respectful. Notice what I'm doing. I'm voicing my intention.
Mm.
Out of respect for your level of energy, which would you prefer? Should we build a micro habit,
Yes.
or should we just call it a day and do a checkout on those insights? Which would serve you best?
I mean, how long do you think the micro habit will take? I think we've
I don't
done a
think it's
lot anyway, so
yeah,
probably
yeah. I
not
don't
the
think it's very long.
most crucial. Yeah.
Let's say that right now I'm going to use my intuition on this, right? So this is not just rational. My intuition is telling
Yeah.
me that if you look at your daily communication with a micro habit, you'll probably remember to use something more than if we just leave insights on the table which are generic. So we can just
Yeah.
spend the next 10 minutes looking at a micro habit, and I can write it up for you and send it off in an email so that you can digest that
Mm.
later when you had more time. So we
Okay.
can just have a quick look at what would be, and it doesn't have to be that it's a fully made micro
Yeah.
habit. I can just put something on the table and then we can build off it in email later. I'll show you what it's like. Basically, a micro habit goes like this.
Yeah.
You might know
Absolutely. No, that sounds
James
good.
Clear.
I'm gonna turn this video off. Just my internet is acting up again.
Okay.
Just let me see until it stabilizes. At least okay, I can see your screen now.
I'll put this big
Yeah.
now so that you can see. So a micro habit, like I'm using the ideas behind James Clear's Atomic Habits, which are quite famous at the moment. The idea is that if you have a trigger is a thing that switches off your autopilot. So you're in a meeting and suddenly something happens. So it could be, for example, a particular relation with a person. It could be a place, a team, a job that you're doing, a touch point or a communication channel that triggers. And that trigger then leads you to go, okay, autopilot off, I'm going to try something different. And then you have three things that come into play immediately, which are, since we talked about the three levels being important, you have an intention with a behavior and some words that lead you to a reward, which creates a reward loop with dopamine usually that is the same mechanics as gambling or any other UX design. It's like when you do this a few times, if the reward comes, it's gonna build you a habit loop that makes you want to do that again in the future. So that's essentially what a
Yeah.
microhabit is, and each of those squares could be a periodic table element from the rather large periodic table in the background here. So what I did is I noted down a few elements here that were relevant from the periodic table that we can use in this microhabit. But what would be the trigger is perhaps where we should start. Like, based on what we talked about,
Yeah.
perhaps the trigger could be something to do with authority, boundaries, and conflicts. Or is there another trigger that we could
Yeah.
use? A situation that
Let's do it.
would be like, that's it. I know that now I'm going to try something else. Perhaps conflicts.
What could be?
Or leadership is another
Yeah, it
one.
could be
So
conflict. It could be what other? Mm-hmm.
you talked about authority earlier. We could use a microhabit to help you establish the
Yeah.
green authority, which is the authority that comes from people trusting you, rather than the authority of having the blue authority of being the expert, or the red authority of being the one who has the most charisma. The green authority is the most useful. That's what politicians who are successful
Right.
usually use. They use green authority. So we could build a microhabit that gives you the reward of green authority, that people basically they would implicitly go, yes, we trust Selam more than anybody else. And it could be that the trigger is when there is a situation that you have in a meeting, or I don't know what at the moment is the most frequent. Usually the micro habits work best if it's very, very regular. So you talked about recruiting. You do a lot of recruiting.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
What else do you do often? Recruiting, social media.
I guess organizing some kind of events. That happens quite often as well.
Okay, so events could be good because that's something that you're usually going to be preparing. So it gives you a bit more space to maneuver. So let's say the event is the trigger. And one way of looking at this is that we can either look at it from when you prepare the event or when you're in the event and you need to take over. What is the one that feels right now the most useful for you?
I think preparing, because that requires pulling in a lot of other people, organizing, and that's where the balls keep getting dropped in, or like I have to push a bit for some of the tasks.
Okay, so preparing a meeting. So the touch point could be when you invite, because the most visible thing of the preparation for others is when they're being invited to the event. So they generally receive a calendar invite with a date, a time bucket, and a purpose of meeting. So in invitation, you have an opportunity to gain the green authority by voicing the intentions. So the action would be to invite with a clear intention that goes beyond what typical invitations go. Like, normal invitation is usually a list of topics, possibly people speaking, but you could play with the idea of doing a chaotic invitation, which brings a little bit more structure into the process and the roles. So in other words, you're basically establishing your authority as a host. Usually it's a hosting team of at least two people. There's a host and a harvester. So what you could do there is to have in the invitation a clear chaotic role. Who's hosting, who's harvesting, who are the experts, why are they invited? So that you don't have to establish your authority when you start, because people have already been invited with that clear sandbox that today Selam is hosting the first hour and Johnny is hosting the second hour and somebody else is harvesting that, and those who turn up are expected to have this prepared. So going a little bit further in the invitation brings that authority with the invitation embedded in it. That could be one way of doing it. When do you send invitation usually, is it a green timing, a blue timing, or a red timing? Like, let's take it last event that you invite.
Green.
Green.
No, it's very green. Yeah, we
So
spend a lot of time thinking when would be best for
for
the
them.
guests.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So green timing is what you're already doing. Green timing is a non-verbal. The intention would be out of respect, most likely one of the green intentions to be aligned with the green non-verbal. Green intention of respect for the collective time, because they all have their busy time management. So out of respect for our collective time and not implied waste time, for that to be less wasteful of time, I'm inviting with roles, with chaotic roles, where there's a clear host, there's a clear harvester, and they have a chance to either agree with it, challenge it, or go with it and turn up with a smile that they are actually invited as an expert or participant. It's a small shift as a micro habit, but what might happen after you test it is that you find that people are not used to receiving invitations of that nature. They tend to receive just a list of topics or just the topic itself of the big umbrella topic. So maybe worth trying out and seeing, and then we can have another chat about if that needs to be fine-tuned a little bit. But that could be one easy thing that you do that takes literally a few minutes when you do the invitation, to just add in there who is invited. And okay, let me add something a little bit more challenging for you, because you know how to do this. Let's add a green sentence for each person, a green positive phrase why each person is invited. That's a very elegant way of getting green authority. Like, Selam is invited because of her expertise on XYZ. Johnny is invited because of his expertise on XYZ. That is not only establishes your authority as being a trustworthy host who understands your team, but it also makes everybody turn up feeling valued.
Yeah.
So that could be one little tweak. I'll write this up. Don't worry. I'll add this into the email to you so that you can have all that written up. But maybe the micro habit would be trigger when you're preparing an event, intention, respect for the collective time, action in green timing, words, invite with clear roles and a positive phrase for each person invited, including the hosting team, whoever else is hosting. And the reward, hopefully, would be that you would get more green authority in that role and not be so much like feeling uncomfortable about taking over the process, because you're doing it for the collective benefit of time saving.
Yeah.
So how
I'll try this tomorrow.
How often, oh, you're doing that tomorrow? Okay. So I'm not going to write it up tonight though. Cool. So,
No, I'm kidding. No, we have an event coming up. We have 2 events coming up, one next week and the one the week after. And we definitely need to send out the invites this week. So it's just about to start preparing the content for the invites tomorrow and Wednesday. So tomorrow and Thursday. So
well, I'll do that first thing in
just
the morning.
saying, I can already see how I could include this. It's
excellent. Selam, as a checkout, so that we close this process and get you off to eat and rest for the day. What has shifted today, if anything at all? Like there's a lot of topics that emerged. You mentioned that approaching conflicts, boundaries, influence, authority, all these things. What has shifted inside you about your posture towards other people?
I think one is just seeing it from outside, because to be honest, like, even I was quite impressed by or surprised by the results, because I don't even remember answering any of these questions because they were not asked in that sense, right? Like it was a lot of different things that were asked, but I didn't realize it was going to come up this way. So that was quite interesting to visualize it, and also to just watch it as an outsider, and having it being like read and described by you and saying this means that, and this means you're doing more of this and less of that, that's quite impressive, or quite it was interesting. Like I said, I didn't know what I was expecting. So this was so amazing to just provide the opportunity to like reflect also, and see what could be done, and not just assurance, but also the other side where, oh, I could do more of this or I could do less of that, which was some areas that you think, or I like I said, I communicate a lot, I interact a lot with people on the daily. So there will be moments where I'm thinking, yeah, at this point I've figured it out. I know exactly, I can talk to a rock if I need to, but that doesn't mean all of the communication is very efficient and I guess, yeah, effective as well. So just this was really amazing to just see that being displayed like this.
Sounds like then it was a useful 2 hours spent, and thank you for playing the game and being sort of so open about yourself on a public stream, which is not a given for everybody. Many people don't feel comfortable doing that. So thank you as well, Selam, for doing that. When we go offline, when I finish, if we just stay behind, I'll do the wrap up after we've closed the stream. Next Tuesday, for those of you interested, we're going to be doing a stream at the same time, but we're going to do a coaching group this time. So a bit like we did today with you, Selam, we're going to have 4 people who've done the same scan, but who've got videos to analyze it themselves. And we're going to have a conversation, a dialogue about what that means for all of them as a group. So it's going to be a group coaching session online. That's next Tuesday. Very different. So those watching are interested in that. That's going to pop up in the same LinkedIn format streams as this one here. And Selam, thank you. May the green force be with you in your startup ecosystem, if I dare say so. And I hope that we get a chance to continue this conversation about how emotional intelligence unfolds in places where startups are working actively to change the world. So thank you very much on that. Good night, everybody, and I will end the stream.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting. This is great. And I'll stay behind so we can wrap up. But yeah.
Ciao. Good night.
Bye, everyone, whoever was watching.